A grieving single dad rescues neglected twin girls, offering warmth and safety. Together, they heal, forming an unexpected family bound by quiet kindness, trust, and second chances. Before we begin, if you believe in the quiet magic of kindness and healing with love, subscribe, and let's walk this path together. Snow drifted like ash from an unseen fire, falling soft and heavy in the pale light of morning. The bus stop was little more than a rusted pole with a faded timetable nailed to it, half buried in the crust of ice at the roadside. No one else stood waiting, only two small girls pressed together on the bench, their thin coats no match for the February cold. They shared one pair of gloves between them, each clutching a hand inside the wool while the other stiffened in the open air. Across the street, Daniel watched them. He stood still in the shadow of an old oak, boots biting into the frozen ground, his breath rising in pale clouds. He had parked his truck further down the road and walked here without quite knowing why. He'd told himself it was because of the snowstorm forecasted to hit that afternoon, but deep down he knew better. Every morning for the past week he'd passed this bus stop on his way to the lumberyard and seen them. Two girls, identical down to the tilt of their chins, their heads bent as though they were trying to fold themselves into nothingness. They were always early, waiting in silence, their faces pale against the wind. He'd noticed their shoes first, thin canvas sneakers with soles that flapped as they walked, and the bruise-shaped shadows under their eyes. Today, something felt different. The smaller of the two shivered so violently the bench rattled under her. Her sister, he assumed she was older by a minute or two, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Daniel's hands flexed in his pockets. He'd brought a thermos with him this time, filled with cocoa. He hadn't planned what to do beyond that. He wasn't sure he even had the right to approach them. But then the wind came sharp and cold from the north, and the smaller girl coughed, a dry, hollow sound that cut through the quiet. Daniel stepped off the curb. The crunch of his boots on ice made the girls look up in unison. Two pairs of blue-gray eyes fixed on him. Fear flickered there, faint but unmistakable, and their hands clasped tighter. He stopped a few feet away, lowering himself to one knee so he wouldn't seem so tall. His heart thudded hard enough he thought they might hear it. "You're freezing out here," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "I've got some cocoa. It's warm. Would you like some?" The older girl's fingers tightened around her sister's. She shook her head once. "All right," Daniel murmured. He set the thermos carefully on the edge of the bench. "If you change your minds." The younger girl's lips parted, as if she wanted to speak, but her sister squeezed her hand and she fell silent again. He lingered a moment longer, then reached up and unwound the scarf from his neck. It smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Slowly, slowly enough for them to see he meant no harm, he draped it over the smaller girl's shoulders. Her eyes widened. "Keep it," he said. "It's cold today." The older one frowned but didn't pull it off. Daniel straightened and stepped back. "I'll leave you be," he told them. "But I'll come by tomorrow." As he turned and walked away, he felt the weight of their gaze on his back. That night, Sophie wrote in the little journal her mother had left behind. The man with the soft eyes left his warmth behind. Lila said not to trust him, but I think he looks lonely too. She closed the journal and slipped it under her pillow before Lila could see. In the next room, Uncle Ray's footsteps thudded unevenly across the floorboards. The sound of a bottle clinking against the counter followed. Sophie curled tighter into her thin blanket. "Don't talk to strangers," Lila whispered from the other bed. "That's what Mom said." Sophie nodded, though her fingers curled tight around the edge of the scarf. It smelled safe. Daniel sat by the fire in his small cabin, staring at his hands. They were rough and cracked from years of work, but they trembled as he reached for the wooden block on the table. He turned it over in his palms, then began to carve. He didn't know why he was doing this, making little birds out of wood, but the shape came easily under his knife. He thought of small fingers clutching them, of quiet smiles. He thought of his daughter. And then he pushed the memory away like he always did. The next morning, the snow was heavier. Daniel arrived at the bus stop earlier than usual. The girls were there, as always, sitting stiffly on the bench. The scarf was wrapped snug around Sophie's neck. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he set down another thermos, this one with a note tied around it. "It's just cocoa. Nothing more." Then he walked back to his truck and sat behind the wheel, watching from a distance. Sophie reached for the thermos. Lila pulled her hand back. But Sophie whispered something, and this time Lila didn't stop her. Together, they unscrewed the lid and sipped cautiously. Steam curled around their faces. For the first time, Daniel saw Sophie smile. It was small, fragile, but it was enough. In the cabin that night, he carved 2 small birds from oak wood. He didn't know if they'd ever take them. He didn't even know if they'd speak to him. But he knew he couldn't stop trying. Not this time. And somewhere deep in the woods, the snow fell silently, covering everything in a soft, unbroken white. The wind howled through the bare trees, rattling the brittle branches like bones. Snow lashed sideways across the narrow road, coating the world in a restless white. The bus hadn't come yet, though the girls had been waiting for nearly an hour. Their small bodies hunched on the bench, shivering, faces pinched with cold. Sophie's nose was raw and red. Lila's lips had cracked open and bled without her noticing. Daniel stood on the other side of the road again, hands jammed deep in his coat pockets. He'd tried staying in his truck, but the sight of them through the windshield, fragile as sparrows in a storm, had driven him out into the cold. This time, he didn't bother with distance. He crossed the road, his boots crunching loud over ice. Neither girl looked up. "The bus isn't coming," he said gently. "The storm's too heavy. It's safer inside." Sophie glanced at him, eyes wide and questioning, but Lila squeezed her hand tight enough to make her wince. "Don't talk to him," Lila whispered, her voice a breathless rasp that barely carried over the wind. Daniel crouched low, careful not to loom. The scarf he'd given them still clung around Sophie's neck, stiff now with frost. "You don't have to come with me," he said softly. "But you can't stay here. You're going to get sick. Just for an hour. Just to warm up." Lila stared at him, unblinking. Her jaw was set like stone, but her fingers trembled where they clutched Sophie's hand. A gust of wind tore down the street, and Sophie cried out as her hood was ripped back. Her hair, pale and fine, whipped across her face. Daniel reached out without thinking, tucking it behind her ear. The movement was so small, so quiet, but Sophie didn't flinch. "Please," he murmured. "It's too cold." Lila's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Only an hour," she said finally, her voice no louder than the wind. "Only an hour," Daniel promised. The cabin sat on the edge of the woods, its roof heavy with snow. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, the scent of burning pine carrying through the storm. Daniel opened the door and stepped back, letting the girls in first. They moved like startled deer, hesitant, muscles coiled to run. Sophie clung to her sister's sleeve, her eyes darting from the worn rug to the low-beamed ceiling to the fire flickering in the hearth. "It's warm here," Sophie whispered. "It's safe here," Daniel said, though his voice caught slightly on the word safe. The girls stood stiffly by the door until Daniel went to the kitchen and began to busy himself. The kettle hissed as he set it over the flames. He pulled thick socks from a drawer and laid them on the edge of the sofa. "You can sit if you'd like," he said without looking at them. "Or you can stand. Whatever feels best." Slowly, Sophie inched toward the fire, her face softening in the glow. Lila followed, wary but unwilling to let her sister stray too far. When the tea was ready, Daniel poured it into 2 chipped mugs and set them on the low table. Beside them, He placed a plate of bread and jam. "Eat as much as you want," he said. The girls exchanged a glance. Lila's chin lifted slightly, but Sophie's stomach growled, and the sound seemed to make her decision for her. She reached for a slice of bread. Lila didn't stop her this time. Daniel didn't sit with them. He stayed near the window, carving a piece of oak with his pocket knife, the soft rasp of the blade filling the silence. Sophie chewed slowly, savoring each bite. Lila dipped her fingers in the tea, testing the warmth before sipping. "Do you live here alone?" Sophie asked after a while. Daniel nodded. "Yes." "Why?" The question hung in the air like mist. Lila shot her sister a warning look, but Daniel only shrugged. "Because my little girl doesn't live with me anymore." "Oh." Sophie went quiet. She pressed the mug close to her chest, letting the heat seep into her hands. Lila's voice was sharp when it came. "We're not staying." "I know," Daniel said. "Just an hour." When the hour passed, the girls stood reluctantly. Sophie's cheeks were warm now, her eyes less dull, but Lila's guard never slipped. "You'll take us back?" she asked. "Of course." Before they left, Daniel knelt and reached into his pocket. He held out two small wooden birds, each no bigger than a walnut, their wings spread as if ready to take flight. "I made these for you," he said. "You don't have to take them, but if you keep them in your pockets, they'll sing for you when you're scared." Sophie reached for hers immediately. Lila hesitated, then accepted the second bird with stiff fingers. "Thank you," Sophie whispered. Daniel smiled faintly. "You're welcome." The drive back was quiet. Snow piled on the road's edges, soft and heavy, muffling the world. When they arrived, Daniel watched as the girls climbed the narrow steps to their apartment. A light flickered in one of the windows. "Be careful," he said as they slipped inside. Sophie turned at the door, her scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She lifted the little wooden bird and waved once. And then she was gone. That night, Daniel sat by the fire, staring at the empty mugs on the table. He felt a deep ache in his chest. Not sharp, not unbearable, but steady like something long denied. In his hands, he turned over a fresh block of oak. His knife flashed in the firelight, shaving curls of wood that fell like snow to the floor. There would be another bird tomorrow. He didn't know why he felt so certain they'd come back. But he did. The snow began to thaw in ragged patches, leaving behind gray slush and the smell of damp earth. At the cabin, the fire still burned low every night, and the little wooden birds sat on the mantel like sentinels. Daniel carved more of them, though he didn't say why. Not to himself, and certainly not to the two girls who now came to sit by his hearth every morning the bus didn't show. Sophie laughed sometimes now, a quiet sound like water trickling over stones. Lila never laughed. She kept her hand curled protectively around her sister's, as if letting go might send her spinning off into the cold. Daniel didn't press her. He had learned that trust came slowly, like spring inching out from under winter's shadow. But cracks were beginning to show. One night, as Daniel walked back from the store in town, he passed their building. It was an old, leaning thing, paint peeling in long curls, windows dark except for one where pale curtains twitched and a man's voice shouted. A bottle crashed against a wall. Daniel froze in the snow, listening as the shouting turned into a string of curses, then a sudden silence so complete it pressed against his ears. He gripped the paper bag in his hand until it crumpled. His heart thudded with a strange mix of anger and dread. When he finally moved, it was only to retreat into the dark. At the cabin that night, he sat staring at the photograph of his wife, her smile caught forever in softer days. His hand trembled as he reached for it, but he pulled back. Instead, he picked up his knife and began carving. By the time the fire had burned low, a small figure took shape in his hands. Not a bird this time, but a girl sitting cross-legged, her face tilted skyward. He set it down gently, though his chest ached so much it felt like splintered wood. The next morning Sophie arrived at the cabin alone, her coat unzipped and hair tangled. "Lila told me to run," she said, her voice tight as though holding back a sob. Her lip was split, and a dark bruise bloomed on her cheek like spilled ink. "She said you'd know what to do." Daniel knelt, hands hovering but not touching her until she flung herself against his chest. He wrapped her in his arms, feeling her small frame shake as she buried her face in his coat. "Where's your sister?" he asked. "She stayed. She said she'd make him stop looking for me." The words lodged like a stone in his throat. "Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone but me." He pulled an old blanket around her shoulders and set her by the fire. She clutched one of the wooden birds so tightly he feared it might crack in her fist. Daniel hesitated only long enough to make sure the cabin door locked behind him. Then he stepped into the storm. Ray's apartment stank of beer and something acrid that burned the back of Daniel's throat. He found Lila crouched in the corner, her arms wrapped over her head. Ray stood over her, swaying slightly, his face blotched red. "She ran off, huh?" Ray slurred. "That little brat of yours. Thought she was too good for this house." "She's not mine," Lila whispered, her voice so soft Daniel barely heard it. Ray raised a hand. Daniel caught his wrist mid-swing. The older man turned, blinking like he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing. "You," he said. "The do-gooder. Get away from her." Ray yanked his arm back, stumbled, then lunged. He was fast, but years of labor had made Daniel stronger. He caught Ray by the collar and shoved him against the wall hard enough to rattle the plaster. "You don't touch them again," Daniel said, his voice low but shaking with fury. Ray sagged, his fight spent. "Take them then," he spat. "See if I care. Just another mouth I don't have to feed." Lila's eyes, wide and glassy, met Daniel's. He crouched low and held out a hand. "Come on," he said softly. She hesitated only a moment before slipping her hand into his. Back at the cabin, Sophie leapt up when the door opened, her eyes wet. She threw herself at her sister, clutching her so tightly it seemed they might fuse together. "You came back," Sophie whispered. "I told you I would," Lila said, though her voice trembled. Daniel set a kettle on the stove, giving them time. His hands shook as he poured water over the tea leaves. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing. He only knew he couldn't do nothing. As the girls curled up on the sofa under an old quilt, Sophie whispered something to her sister that made Lila's shoulders sag with relief. Daniel stood by the fire, staring at the little wooden figure he'd carved the night before. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, or the day after. He only knew he couldn't let them go back. For now, that would have to be enough. The snow had melted into the thirsty earth, leaving behind soft mud and the first stubborn shoots of green pushing up along the cabin's edge. Birds called from the trees now, filling the woods with a tentative kind of music. The air smelled faintly of wet pine and wood smoke, and the world felt less brittle than it had before. Inside the cabin, Sophie and Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a scatter of wood shavings. Daniel watched them from the kitchen table, his carving knife idle in his hand. Sophie's laughter rang out as she held up a lopsided wooden bird she'd tried to carve herself. Its wings were uneven, its head too big, but she seemed proud anyway. Lila, more careful with her hands, focused intently on her own piece, tongue caught between her teeth. "You'll get splinters," Daniel murmured, but his voice lacked warning. Sophie looked up, her smile quick and bright. "Then you can fix them." He turned the little bird in his hand, running his thumb over its smooth wings. He didn't tell her how many times he'd almost called someone, how many times he'd thought, "This can't last, someone will come for them." But no one had. No knocks on the door. No phone calls demanding answers. Just silence. And the silence was terrifying and wonderful all at once. The day social services finally arrived, the air was thick with the scent of spring rain. A knock echoed through the cabin, sharp and official. Sophie jumped. Lila went stiff beside her. Daniel opened the door slowly. A woman in a gray coat stood on the step, her expression careful but not unkind. Behind her, a car idled on the dirt road. "Daniel Whitaker?" she asked. "Yes. I'm here about the girls." Her eyes softened as they landed on the twins peeking from behind his legs, their faces pale but resolute. "They're safe here," Daniel said, his voice low. "I won't let them go back." "I'm not here to take them," she said gently. "Not yet. We're figuring out what's best." Lila's grip on Sophie's hand tightened until her knuckles whitened. "We'll be good," Sophie blurted out. "Please don't send us away. We'll clean and cook and do whatever you want." The woman crouched down to their level, her expression softening. "Sweetheart, this isn't about being good. It's about being safe." "They're safe here," Daniel said again, but his throat felt tight. The woman studied him for a long moment, then stood. "I'll be in touch," she said quietly. When her car disappeared down the road, Daniel sagged against the doorframe. Sophie and Lila stood frozen in the middle of the room, their eyes wide and searching. "Are they taking us?" Sophie whispered. Daniel knelt in front of them. "Not if I can help it," he said. Weeks passed like the slow turning of pages. There were hearings in cramped courtrooms, the air stale and heavy with tension. Ray never showed. Daniel sat straight-backed as he answered questions, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The judge's eyes were sharp but softened slightly when they fell on the girls clinging to his coat sleeves. Temporary custody was granted with a single firm stroke of a pen. The ride home was quiet. Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath warm through his shirt. Lila sat stiffly on the other side, holding her carved bird in both hands. Halfway down the road, Lila spoke for the first time since the courthouse. "It's your turn now," she said, her voice small but steady. "To be brave." Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened, and he swallowed against the sudden ache in his throat. "I'll try," he said. Spring bloomed fully at the cabin. Daniel and the girls planted a small garden in the soft earth out back, their hands stained with dirt. Sophie chattered about flowers and bees while Lila carefully buried seeds in neat rows. As they worked, Sophie glanced up at him, her expression tentative. Do we get to call you Dad now?" Daniel's breath caught. He set down the spade and knelt in the dirt, meeting her eyes. "Only if I get to call you my daughters," he said softly. Sophie's smile was shy but radiant. Lila's face softened, and for the first time, she nodded without hesitation. That night, Daniel found Sophie's little journal tucked beneath her pillow. The last page was filled with crooked letters and smudges of dirt. "We found home. It has soft eyes and calloused hands." He closed the book carefully and set it back where he found it. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and for the first time in years, Daniel let himself believe he wasn't alone anymore. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Quiet kindness can change everything. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Quiet kindness can change everything.